Hello, sunflowers, and good afternoon. Welcome to Good Journeys Tarot. This is 78 cards in 78 weeks, where I go through and explore each card as in-depthly as I can in my attempt to draft my own version of the cards. And each week I share that with you on Sundays as accountability for myself, right? And this week we are going to be talking about the Page of Wands. Right now, there's not really a lot going on here at Good Journeys Tarot, apart from planning the 78 cards each week and getting ready for Northwest Tarot Symposium, getting my bags packed and stressing out over traveling and all of that good stuff. And so we're going to hop right in today and welcome our guest. Our guest today really probably doesn't need any introduction, but if you're a first-time guest here or you just haven't happened upon her yet, we're going to be speaking with Christiana Gaudet of Card and Craft, and also the organizer of STAARCON. She has written on the tarot, presented on the tarot, and last year was the World Divination Association's Tarot Reader of the Year. We're so glad to have Christiana Gaudet with us here today. Welcome, Christiana.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. I'm so honored to be here. It is great to see you. We haven't spoken since STARCON last year.
Right.
And so I'm happy to be talking with you now.
Yay. I'm very glad to have you here and talk about this card with you. I did post links to Christiana's content and her website in the description box below if you want to check that out. So we are, again, talking about the Page of Wands, our fiery youth as it is. This is a card for me, Christiana, that I always struggled with in the Smith-Waite because I felt like this image told me nothing. I always felt like it was just this guy standing there holding a stick, and it didn't speak to me intuitively anything. And there's usually one or two cards in every deck that does that for me. This just happens to be that card in the Smith-Waite, and so I had to read what he said about this when I first got the tarot, and so what is going on in here? And to me, it feels like perhaps he's leaning into the Marseille tradition of the Page of Wands as the announcer or messenger, that revealer. And Robin Wood actually calls that key in her deck Hearken.
Hearken. I love that. Yeah. I always loved this image because it's like, I have something to say. And as a child and now an adult, I always have something to say. So I really identify with that sense of heralding and announcement and listen to me.
Yeah, I guess when I've looked at it, I didn't see that whole I'm announcing something idea come across to me from my perspective. And so now that I know that's where he was going and what the image was supposed to portray that Pamela Coleman Smith created, it does. I understand it when I see it. Though I like for the courts to have some elements that I can intuitively, pick up about who they are and their energy and that type of thing. That's one thing that Robin Wood does really well is she really puts the fire and the earth and the air in their outfit. So you know immediately, okay, this is a member of the fire court. And she really puts that energy into her wands as well, using the crystals and all. And so I do like that one.
Although traditionally, if you look at the weight, we've got the salamanders on the cloak or the tunic, which would be fire, and the sprouting leaves, which is, very literally fire. So it's here. I would argue that it's here.
Yeah, I feel like the Robin Wood is a little more energetic, and that's one of the things I like to see in more modern decks for this card. But yes, it's there once you understand what the card is about. But as a new person studying tarot 16 years ago, I was just like, okay, there's a guy holding a stick. What's that about? What's
So the other thing, and when we get to showing some of our cards, is I was like trying to go through my multi, like many hundreds of decks collection and pick out just a few. I realized half of them are wearing really funky hats and the other aren't. And I don't know what it is specifically about pages that wear hats, but they do. But his hat has a red feather. And if you think about the red feather in the major arcana, where the red feather is worn by 3 characters, which I believe is the Fool, Death, and the Sun. That's a really interesting connection with the Page of Wands. I'd have to spend a long time thinking about what that says to me, but I'm sure it says something.
Yeah, yeah. So the Life is Like a Board Game calls this development of news and enthusiasm. And I like that idea of enthusiasm. That's something that a card we both have really gets in their image, the Light Seers.
Yes.
And that's the only card we had in common when I saw your post earlier is this Light Seers card. This is actually the deck that I was using to read for my weekly reading this week. And I do love the images in it, but I have so many decks. It's hard to choose, right? When you're going to do a reading. So, but that enthusiasm comes across in other ways in other decks. One is the use of fire. I love Jamie Elford as a fire dancer in the Pocket of Peers. And there are some other cards that adopted the same idea of playing with fire, like the Urban Tarot. It's actually a fire eater. And so it kind of lends to this idea for me that perhaps the Page of Wands is our performer. This is the youthful person that stands out, like they are creatively in some way, like whether they're standing out front making that announcement or they're dancing or whatever the performance might be, they're the one who's going to stand out.
So to that, I've got your, I see your Pocket of Peers, and I raise you a Gaian, which is the child of fire, where it's not as much performance, but really playing with the fire. But when you talk about performance, I think we could even take that, going back to the Page of Wands and Light Seers, we could take that like in 2 directions, more athletic, as in Aunt Lily's tarot, where it looks like she's playing some sort of a sport. Or many decks. Here we have Sacred Sisterhood, and here we have Crystal Visions, where they're both playing instruments.
Yeah, that's also true in the Fyodor Pavlov and the This Might Hurt tarot. I love how this deck incorporates the imagery from the Smith-Waite, but puts it in a different setting. So like the blouse is actually the salamanders that we see in the Smith-Waite there. And it's interesting that your Gaian tarot had a child in it. I actually have several here with children. The Sassurabito, which is the child of fire, the Page of Fire there. And one of my favorite decks, the Slow Tarot. I love this kid camping out with the campfire and holding his staff. See, this kind of like speaks to me more than say that page in the Smith-Waite, where I get there's some energy going on here that initially I didn't see there in the Smith-Waite. So, yeah.
I have from Mother Piece. This is my mini Mother Piece, so I'm going to really hold it up for you to see.
Let me just embiggen you here.
The Daughter of Wands, which I think really has that exuberance you were talking about.
Why can't I do?
There we go. Where she's like she's dancing, she's running with, what is that? It's like a unicorn, and there's big birds, and she's just I guess it's dancing, which goes back to that performance aspect, but there's just something so energetic here.
Speaking of unicorns and the modern love, it is a child again, and you'll see they're pretending to be in a fantasy world there. They've got their unicorn, and their little castle. And so this idea of creativity coming up in play, which is energy. Energy is important to me, I guess, for fire. I don't get energy from the announcer, so to speak. So, yeah. A couple of other kids that showed up in here were about creation. So we've got our young artist in the
Oh,
Hip Chick Tarot. They're called Childs, and she calls them create versus fire or wands. And then in the Mystic Garbage Tarot, funny story. I got this off the trade table at STAARCON.
did
Uh,
you?
yeah, it was a second copy of this deck. The first copy didn't have a box or a little white book or anything to explain the images that I didn't comprehend what she did. And this one did. So I have two copies. This one's from
Oh,
STAARCON. And she treats her pages as children, and they're usually interacting with an animal in some way. This idea of imagination and creativity there. So, and a little bit of a risk taker, our Page of Wands, climbing the ladder on top of the elephant's back and that type of thing. We mentioned briefly competition earlier, this idea of competitiveness that comes across. What other cards did you have to share with us
so
today?
a few. Now, in Enchanted Tarot, which is also known as the Zerner Farber Tarot, the pages are princesses, and all the pages are reading or writing letters. And that goes back again to this idea of page as communicators, announcer, herald. I think in this modern time, when I see pages, if we're talking about business or advertising, pages often say to me, be careful about your web page. Make sure your web page or social media presence is on point. And we really see that here, where she is either reading or writing a letter.
And
Um,
in the Spirit Keepers Tarot, which I don't have I have a copy back here, but don't have out, she called them the heralds.
mm,
And most decks will reference the idea of pages as messengers, even if that's not in the image itself. Like
sure.
on my card, which we'll see in a minute, I'm using a little envelope icon to denote them as a messenger, versus actually having a letter or something in there. So
Now,
let's explore that idea about princesses. You mentioned the
oh,
princess.
yeah. The question is because, pages can be page or princess. We've also got valet, we've got sota, we've got seer. I love this energetic one from World Spirit Tarot, seer of wands. And it's interesting that in a couple of these, they're controlling animals, which I think is interesting that, these children have this ability to control animals. But most typically in English, it's going to be page or princess. And
Mhm.
we recognize that the princess really comes in from the Crowley tradition, but shows up in a lot of decks. And the question on my mind is like, I'll give you two examples of princesses, right? The Princess of Wands, but also from one of my favorite decks, the Princess of Wands from Spiral Tarot. I will say that this is the page card that I love to hate because what is this? So many pages are with dragons. We see dragons with the page in back to Crystal Visions. We see dragons with the page in Encore Tarot from Ciro Marchetti. Dragons are fire. We understand that. But tell me that looks like a baby dragon in any kind of, I don't know, like what kind of alien elf are you? And so I love to hate this card. But I love that she's clothed in sunflowers. I think that's beautiful. And she has a wreath of acorns on her head. I love that. But the big question is, if you're working with a deck that has princesses instead of pages, do you inherently interpret princess differently than page? Now, Lisa Robertson, in her very well loved court card book, says you should, that princesses are inherently different from pages. I respectfully disagree. What do you think?
Well, I think of the face of it, considering a princess versus a page, that the idea of a messenger is a little bit lost.
Mhm.
Um, but and having studied the Thoth a bit, the understanding there is completely different of the pages from, say, the Smith Waite. One seeing them as the culmination of their suit, like having all the energy of their suit, and the other seeing them as like a beginning, a
Mm.
messenger of things to come, which is how I've always interpreted them. So if I see a princess, I do typically interpret it very much the same way I do a page,
Right.
just because that's my own preference and experience. But at face value, they do feel very different when they come up.
And it is true if you're thinking about the characters in a monarchy, the page has a different job than the princess, certainly. Although in modern times, if we refer to someone as a princess, we're very likely referring to them as a diva who is probably asking for something or talking about something, because if you're a princess, you're going to feel that right to express.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned some of the ones here controlling animals, mainly dragons. And it occurs to me a card I didn't take out because it's one of the two that I don't care for in the Bonestone and Earthflesh Tarot was the Page of Wands. And it is actually a youth controlling a tiger. And but I wasn't particularly excited about that image. So I do get that though. The idea of controlling an animal is interesting.
So
Um, Go ahead.
one of the things, like when we talk about performing, like the violin, like the flute player, even the Page of Wands here, or the athlete, or even here in Stephen Bright's Spirit Within Tarot, we're crouched and getting ready to do something. And the idea of that student performer, I think, is so critical for two reasons. Number one, pages can talk about going to school, being a student, learning something new. And when we were kids, we were all expected to be creative. Whether we were musical or not, in third grade, we had to get up on stage with the recorder or the flutophone or whatever it was, and we all had to play songs together. We were all expected to perform. We were all expected to be creative. It wasn't until later on that we were separated into, are you good at it or not? And so I think that idea of creating with childlike enthusiasm that we so often forget as adults is so important here. And I think that that idea of being a student, and that when you're a student, you have to be open and enthusiastic. I think that's expressed in all of these.
Absolutely. Um, Oops. Sorry, I was just looking at something here. Um, so the last card that, well, I actually have two more cards, but one of them is just an illustrative purposes. This is the last card that I had to share. This is the Numinous Tarot. In it, they're called candles, and the pages are dreamers. Is what they're calling. So this is the where we're beginning to explore that idea of um, our suit. And I actually had to read the guidebook to realize those are fireflies that she has scattered all around her,
That is
which is an
beautiful.
idea I liked. Fireflies being one of the first signs of true summer here in the South, and just that warm night with the campfire going and the fireflies lighting up. It feels very energetic to me, and I do remember that from being a kid. I don't do it as much as an adult, but and so I kind of liked that. But the idea of them as dreamers is something that I do relate to. In fact, one of my pages is called The Dreamer. It's not this one.
I love
And
that.
and so yeah, that beginning of ideas and dreams coming
Mhm.
up in our mind,
So
related to creativity, really.
I'll share one more from Grateful Dead Tarot, which I wrote about in the brand new autumn edition of the Cartomancer. I wrote about this deck from Grateful Dead Tarot. The Page of Wands is the Page of Bolts. And I'm embarrassed to say I'm not sure what song this is referencing. I'll figure it out, or I'll ask the creators. But I really love her, just her whole vibe here. It's not as energetic. It's not as fiery as some of the other ones, but I think she's sweet.
Wonderful. Are you familiar with the Tarot Disassembled?
I'm not.
So
Oh,
this deck is, oh my goodness, my poor brain. As soon as I try to say her name, I forget it. And but it is by Ferocious Ink on Instagram, Jennifer Steedley.
hmm.
And she will be at Northwest Tarot Symposium talking about symbols in tarot. And basically, she had this idea where, her husband and her son like to take things apart and figure out how they work. And she's like, so what would happen if I do that with the tarot? And just take it apart, and we just have the symbols here. And so these are all symbols from the Smith-Waite imagery. So we see the salamander that we talked about. There's our red feather. And she put the bowler hat in there, that bowler hat being very different than other hats of its time. And she says the bowler hat is important because it was, at the time it was created, it was created so that it would stay on your head. Like during the most dramatic of circumstances, it wouldn't fly off, like, say, a cowboy hat or a bonnet or that type of thing, because it was close to your head and it was shaped like your head. And so it would stay, even no matter what your energy level, really. And
That is,
so that was her idea about the
I love
hat.
that. I love that. I love that explains everything. You could be playing an instrument in a play, doing a sport, and your hat's going to stay on. I'm never going to forget that now. Thank you.
Yeah. And then she talks about the pyramids that are, I've always thought they were mountains, but she calls them pyramids. And I guess because they're pointed, they look a little bit that way. But she equates those to, the spiritual nature of fire, and that kind of thing. And I always see something in her card that I never noticed in some of the other, in like the Smith-Waite image or like another image. I wouldn't say that's true of this one, but in others it has been in the past, the case. And there's that red feather. And since we were talking about the red feather earlier, I thought we'd take a look real quick and see what she said about that feather. There it is. So she equates the feathers with freedom, hope, travel, lightheartedness, as well as transformation, which is something that we see in all of the cards where we have the feather.
Sure.
And so, yeah, but I've enjoyed having this deck to look at the individual symbols, especially to see things that I've not seen before. It's not so much with the courts as with some of the major arcana. They can be so detailed that I overlook some images. We have lots of guests popping in and saying hello. Some of my regulars, like Amy from Strength Reversed. Carolyn McLaughlin is here.
Hey, Carol.
Glad to have you guys here. Did you have any cards that you haven't shown us yet?
Let me see. Well, just briefly, we haven't really talked about it. Soto de Bastos, from Dali Tarot, Salvador Dali. And, again, it's a different hat. It's a top hat, but we have a big old hat. We have a sprouting wand. But then what's this whole thing going on here? Is that fire? I don't know. It's Dali. You never know. But, I don't love this one. I don't get a real great sense of it. Ciro Marchetti from Encore Tarot. His page is young and surrounded by dragons and in very courtly dress. And, the other sort of thing is there is this tradition where pages are female and knights are male. Do you do that?
In my deck, I'm alternating them. For me, I did do, I have, well, actually, the way I've been doing it is by suit. So in water, the page and knight are female, and in fire, they would be male, is the way that I did it. So it balances them out still as far as the representation of gender in the court cards, but it's different than, say, how they're perceived in the Smith way traditionally. But he describes them in his pictorial key as young men. However, historically, most readers view them as female. I mean, and to me, when I look at Pamela Coleman Smith's imagery, they do look very feminine, and perhaps it's just because they're youthful males. I don't know.
And one of the things that, like, for me, I, regardless of the tradition of gender, and regardless of whether it's son, daughter, princess, I might look at a card that denotes a female, and in that moment, if it is about a person, it could very well be your son. For me, gender does not stick in any of the court cards, no matter how they're illustrated.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's a point that uh, many people try to make. You know, the card can be anyone, right? That image is there to give you the context, right? And the description of the person, so to speak, versus saying that it's actually a girl with blonde hair, like is in this image. But I understand too, because it is important to me to see representation in decks of myself and of others that I know. And so I get why people like to see that balance and that inclusivity in the decks that I've tried to go for myself. So we've talked a little bit about the meaning of the card as we've been working through some of our card images. We haven't talked much about what the shadow side or the reverse of this card looks like yet. And so I thought we might explore that a little bit. I keep describing this as an energetic young person. To me, this is like, and on the reverse of that, it to me would almost be that rambunctious youth that's just getting into everything and they're a little rebellious, maybe. But at the same time, they also could be indecisive or lazy, like they're not putting in the energy and the effort to do things. How do you see the reverse of this card?
So if I am seeing it as a kid, that's exactly it. It may be the kid who's not doing his homework. It may be the kid who is not engaging. It may be the kid who, for one reason or another, is having trouble at school, trouble with friends, trouble at home. But if it is a part of us as an adult self, it may be that we're not bringing the fire. We're not bringing the enthusiasm. That could be for emotional reasons, situational reasons, physical reasons. But we so at that point need to honor our inner child and find that way to connect. The other thing is it could be issues with school. Maybe you need to be going to school, or maybe you're in school, but you're not doing what you should be doing. It could also be issues of communication. Maybe you're not communicating with others the way you need. Maybe you're in a relationship. And I mean, are there ever communication problems in relationships? Sometimes, maybe. And maybe that could be an indicator of that.
Sure. I've actually heard several people bring up the idea of not doing your homework with this card, which I think is interesting. Now I'm thinking that probably this week, normally when I draw the card, because I'm doing them randomly, they kind of speak to what's going on in my life. So I'm kind of thinking that this is what we're looking at in correlation to that project I mentioned backstage for the cartomancers. So maybe that's what's going on there. Yes. So the Golden Dawn, for some reason, with the princesses in particular, they have multiple titles for the cards.
Right.
And so that's one. And I've been trying to include the titles just because sometimes they actually do really speak to the understanding of the card for me. And this is one where I'm not sure that I would want to give the card 3 titles. But they call it the Princess of the Shining Flame, or the Rose of the Palace of Fire. And so there's this idea in the titling by the Golden Dawn, at least, that it is a female, perhaps, energy versus a masculine energy in the way that they describe the cards, because they do describe the knights as princes and in other terms. So I did want to, before we jump into what I ended up creating and looking at our next card, just pull up real briefly the Tree of Life, because I mentioned it periodically on here. And the pages are here
Mhm.
on the Tree of Life in Malkut, which is the kingdom. So this is Earth. That's why we say these are Earth and fire, Earth and water, Earth of air, are pages. So um, and when I view it, I look at this as the starting point of exploration to getting to that ultimate goal, whatever it might be. And so, in a way, this is a beginning. The same way that our ace is a beginning, say the creative energy of our suit, which is then manifest in the world. And so when I started creating my card, I actually wanted to reference my ace. And this was the card that I currently have set up for my ace, which is a sparkler. I thought that looked like a wand, and it had that fire, that energy that I was going for. And then I always try to relate these to my personal life. So I grew up on a river, and so the house on the river was just a thing that I thought would be interesting. And so when I created the page, my first thought was, okay, because it's a beginning like the ace, but from a different standpoint, right? That I needed to include some of that same imagery, and so I zoomed in on the image, and then I put in my page, which in my deck I'm using children. And I decided I needed some sparkle. I like the idea of the fireflies and the summer because I associate fire with summer myself personally. And but I found this too busy when I first created it. I was like, okay, that's too much. And then I played with it some more. I removed the stars and some of the fireflies, and then I also did a version where I left the stars but had fewer fireflies. And then I posted it in my Facebook group, Good Journeys into Tarot, where I invite people to give input on the images that I'm working on that week and give their thoughts. And ended up making some more changes. This week, Tony from Tony Antoinette's Intuitive Tarot and Jewelry gave me some insights on it. I was very glad to have her opinion. And I ended up going back and darkening the sky just a little bit and keeping some of the fireflies. So this is the final image at the moment, and I'm calling it the Performer. I wanted to, in creating the deck, I was trying to move away from some of the um, old terminology of the cards, but I didn't want to I didn't want to rename everything, right? So like for me, so this is the messenger or page of fire, right? And that's why I have the symbols there. I have our little envelope for our messenger or a page, and then the fire symbol. And then I just gave them a key name or an archetype title to describe them, how I think of this particular card. And I ended up calling it the Performer. And this is very much something that a lot of us did as kids, especially during the summer when we celebrated 4th of July and Labor Day, playing with sparklers. We would have two in one hand. That was the exciting thing, to have two, not just one, but you had two, and you could swing them around and play with them. And you could use one to ignite the other. And it was a lot of fun. And so I like that energy. And I kept picturing a rambunctious child, right? When I was thinking about the Page of Wands. Ethany Dawn in her book, Your Tarot Court, often refers to this card as Peter Pan. That child who's full of energy and enthusiasm and not really afraid of anything, just go out there and be adventurous. And that's what I felt I would play with fireworks as a kid, and with the sparklers, is that sense of adventure and excitement, enthusiasm that I like to see in the card. So I always invite my guests as well as the people in our chat to share their thoughts on the image. If there's something they like or think could be improved upon, it probably won't even be the final version. I have cards that I did at the beginning that I've redone 3 times since then.
I hope that you don't redo this one. I have to say that this captures, I mean, it is that summer thing, man. That takes me right back to summer with my mother and my grandmother on Shelter Island, which is this cute little island on Long Island between the North Fork and the South Fork, where we would often be for the 4th of July. And they would get me sparklers. And that was like a big deal, that wasn't a thing you did all the time. And that captures, it brings me right back in a way that is so poignant. I feel the spirits of my mother and my grandmother with me as I look at this image. So I hope you don't change it.
Okay. Well, thank you. And again, I'm using Creative Commons imagery to basically draft what I want it to look like. And I'm using the silhouettes mainly because I am not a life drawer, and it is very difficult to find imagery of people that's going to be consistent to use throughout the deck. And so I find this easier, is to just make them silhouettes until I can find an illustrator to do the cards justice, so to speak. While I am shuffling the cards to draw for next week, is there anything coming up for you on your channel or other projects that you have going on that you'd like people to know about?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. So, lots of things. I do want everyone to join me on my YouTube channel, which is Christiana Gaudet Tarot, where we do live readings 4 times a week or so, and 4 or 5 times a month, we do free live classes and tarot meetups. So please join me there, Christiana Gaudet Tarot. Of course, the big thing coming up is STAARCON. That is January 20th through 22nd. You can join us in person in West Palm Beach, Florida, or you can join us online on Accelavance. Accelavance is this very robust conferencing platform. So if you want to do it from the comfort of your home, we'll see you there. If you want to come on in to West Palm Beach in January, I don't know who'd want to do that, really. A new hotel this year, and it is a nice hotel. It's a resort hotel. So either way, staarcon.com, STAARCON.com. And of course, my website, christianagaudet.com. I am always available for readings. And go to Amazon and get my books, Tarot Tour Guide and Fortune Stellar.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us. Next week, I will be speaking with Carl Astrology from YouTube here, and we will be working on the Queen of Swords. Okay, if there's cards that I have been dreading doing, they are, of course, the courts, because I find that when people try to update their courts, they're completely different than the prior systems, and so so I wanted the courts to be right, but I've been really struggling with the idea of doing this card because I've always associated this card with myself, because I'm a Libra, born in October. And so this card pretty much for me has always represented me in a reading. And so for that reason, I've been a little stressed about doing it. So that'll be interesting to do that card as we're coming up. Speaking of my birthday. So in October, Call Astrology is going to be here on the 2nd. On the 9th, of course, I'll be at STAARCON, and
I knew it.
There will be a video from there next on the 9th, but we won't actually be doing 78 cards in 78 weeks. A person that I actually met for the first time at STAARCON will be here on the 16th, Mitchell Osborne. So look forward to that in October. And then we're going to have a special episode on the 22nd, which is my birthday. And we're going to explore the wheel, which I created last year, but we haven't done a video on. And finally, we're going to wrap October up with Sasha Graham doing a spooky October 30th 78 cards in 78 weeks. So that's what you have to look for the next month. More great guests, just like Christiana. Again, so glad that you are here. Glad that everybody is here in the chat. Do like and subscribe to both of our channels, as well as check out the links for other opportunities to work with us and to participate in the things that we do. I will tell you that the videos that Christiana does where she talks about the cards and does readings are just fabulous. I loved the series of videos where you talked about groups of cards. You did this 7, 8, and 9s, the 3, 4, and 5, I think, or something. But you also did like the celestials, and it's always interesting to me to see cards grouped together and how they relate that way. I also enjoyed the one on the clerics where you did the high priestess, the hermit, and the hierophant. And that's something that I have told them here that I'm hoping to explore once I'm done creating all the cards, to get more continuity throughout the entire deck, because I've really only been considering one card at a time right now as I go through this process. So until next time, everyone, good journeys.